to My American Dream, a monthly program of Finlandia Foundation National. During this program series, we are interviewing Finnish entrepreneurs who have come to the U.S. chasing their American dream. Finlandia Foundation is a nonprofit philanthropic organization that was established in Pasadena, California in 1953 for the purpose of supporting and celebrating Finnish American heritage while maintaining ties to contemporary Finland. A major source of private funding for Finnish and Finnish American cultural activities, Finlandia Foundation awards grants and scholarships and sponsors a variety of programs, from concerts to book talks to webinars and online presentations like My American Dream. To finance the production of its programming, Finlandia Foundation relies on private donations. Please visit our website to find out how you can help.
Welcome to this episode of My American Dream. I am today spending my time with Kirsti Chou in rainy San Francisco.
Bless the rains.
Bless the rains. Absolutely needed here. So welcome to the program. Really nice to have you. And let's kick it off with you telling us a little bit about how you ended up on this rainy day in San Francisco.
Sure, thanks for having me here. So yeah, my name is Kirsti Chou. I was born and raised in Salo, so southwestern Finland, and I guess it was early 80s, Finland, and the world looked very different than today, so small town girl. But my family has always been, I would say I actually only realized it afterwards, that they have maybe been much more internationally minded than a lot of families at the time. And my family was actively involved with the Rotary Youth Exchange. So even though I grew up in a tiny town, I got a glimpse into the world that was out there through the exchange students that we hosted. So I think that also kind of sparked this sort of interest in me. Like, I just wanted to see the world, see what else was out there. So I made the decision at the age of 4 to go go somewhere as an exchange student whenever I could. So I moved to Australia at the age of 17, but I always returned. Studied in Turku and did another year in France, and then started my career at Nokia, because actually, being from Salo, it was very much next door. And that's where I did supply chain management, sourcing. So it was definitely an interesting opportunity after school. But I kind of always had this urge or interest in earlier stage companies, startup world. I also come from an entrepreneurial family, so my mom and dad ran a small jewelry shop. And after Nokia, I wanted to make the transition into actually software and also to a smaller company. So I joined an ad tech company in Berlin out of all the options. And I moved to Berlin and helped them grow out a new market, which then became actually the largest market for the company. And I was there all the way through an acquisition. So the company was acquired late 2019. And it was early 2018 actually when I moved here. So I transferred here with that company, and I was leading first a sales team here, and then took on more of a product strategy role towards the end. But yeah, it was partly the job, but also the fact that I met my husband, who is from here. So
funny how that works.
Funny how that works, yes. But I was definitely interested in seeing what it would be like to be out here.
As a younger girl in Salo, did you ever have sort of ideas or visions about that? You have to move to America, or or was it just sort of getting out of Finland, or did you have more of a sort of a sense of what you really wanted to explore?
So I think, yes, I always I definitely had a list of countries that I was most interested in, and I have to say that the US was never on the list.
Okay.
So I never imagined I would move to the US. And I think, I have to admit, like, I think I had a very interesting opinion or like kind of, yeah, I thought the US would not necessarily be the right type of environment for me. I think through news, everything we read and see, it paints a certain type of picture of the US, and that just never really truly appealed to me that much. But it was really through my job at the startup that was headquartered in San Francisco, and through those like trips to San Francisco and the people I met, that my perception of the US and we have to be clear here, like my perception of California and Silicon Valley, which is very different than the rest of the country, started to change, and I actually noticed that I very much loved it. Like I loved my coworkers, I loved the vibe, I loved the sort of how ambitious people are, and how really like the sort of can-do mentality, and also, yeah, I don't know, like there is a positive vibe here.
There is. And the funny thing is that even if like half of the people here are from somewhere else, actually there is still coming, and there always has been coming, a lot of people in this direction from inside of the US.
Oh, absolutely.
Just because the mentality here is different than it is in most other towns.
Yeah. It is so different here, and like it's sometimes hard to kind of put your finger on it, like what is it like exactly that makes this such a unique place, but I guess it's like sort of one thing that at least surprised me is like how small this is. Like I think Silicon Valley seems so much bigger when you're looking at it from the outside, and especially from like across the pond, Atlantic. So you know, there are a lot of people here who are building like incredible things, and they're like very close. We're all very close to each other. So there's a lot of like synergies, a lot of like just this sort of spontaneous conversations that happen, and like serendipity that just happens.
Yeah. And you never get sort of surprised by finding something completely different and new here, because you almost expect it to be that way.
Right. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what do you do now that you are here?
Yeah, so I first came here like, you know, still working for that startup, but so that startup was in ad tech. So we did it was advertising technology. It was, you know, B2B software that I was selling. And as a child, I was actually growing up. As a child, I was sort of dreaming of changing the world, as a lot of us do. And I just never quite knew what I wanted to kind of go deeper into. So I'm very much a generalist myself. And it took me a while to figure that out. Like, you know, when I was asked that as a kid, I would say I want to be the next Kofi Annan, because I thought that, you know, the head of the United Nations, like that's the way you change the world. But obviously, realities are very different. You don't become the next Kofi Annan just like that. And I took a few steps, you know, into like the grassroots nonprofit world, and I very much enjoyed like kind of birthing new types of events that I felt were like contributing positively to the world. But I still had this like kind of growing urge or need to make a move in my career towards something more purposeful. And like when I did that soul searching and like was thinking like, well, okay, what's really important to me? What aligns with my values? Where do I see I can make a difference? Climate change, all that was a pretty obvious thing for me to move towards. And you know, I had known that for a long time. So for years, I had even been telling my boss, you know, at work, I'm like, look, when I leave, I'm actually going to go work on climate. but it took some time to figure out like what specifically in climate, like how could I contribute, like what would fit, you know, my skill set and also personal life situation. Like we have 2 young kids. My husband's an entrepreneur. Our family is kind of very much on 2 continents. So, you know, there's like a lot of pieces that you have to like consider in putting everything together. So after working with a coach and doing some experimenting, I landed at angel investing. One additional sort of driver for me when I learned about the gender gap in venture capital. So this was maybe back in like 2017 or so, when I was kind of seriously considering this as one option. But what really kind of made me lean towards this was just hearing about, first of all, like the funding that female-led companies raise compared to ones founded by men, and other underrepresented founders as well. And that was something that was being discussed a little bit more. But what wasn't really discussed was that who's making the calls, like who is deploying the capital. And when you look at that, it's like 95% white men, and then the rest is, yes. And, you know, I'm not saying that it's all, like not all white men are bad. Like that is definitely not my message here.
Thank you.
But it is really just that we all have a bias. I have a bias, you have a bias. And if we don't have representation on both sides of the table, we simply only found certain types of companies, or we only fund certain types of companies, because it's really difficult for us to understand the world like truly through the eyes of someone who is very different than us.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, when we have more representation on both sides, like we organically, it still takes actually intention and effort to build a more sort of equitable and like a world that really is kind of like serving all of us here more equally. But at least, you know, it allows us to look at things from you know, various angles. We apply like, you know, our own perspective on things. And also, when you think if you have like 5 or 10 people at the table, and if they all look the same, like what are they going to bring to the table? Like it's like, it's not additive. Like, you know, you actually, if you want to you know, have the best functioning teams, or you know, have the most, if you look at like the companies that are most successful today, they all have diverse like leadership. They have, and I'm not talking about just racial or gender, but you know, like skill sets. Like as in you're an early stage, or you're like a VC investing in early stage companies, so, and later stage too. But we all know that we have to look for, you know, what does this team have? Like what makes them unique or particularly like kind of like good for, or you know, what makes them, you know, stand out versus others. It's like, do they have complementary skills? So that was another factor when I like kind of discovered this. I was like, well, I'm definitely gonna like give it a try and see how it is, how it feels. And I have absolutely loved it, because I get to like meet incredible people building like incredibly hard things, and who are very values aligned, and I'm inspired every day.
That's the main thing. So one interesting sort of cultural or question that has to do with Finland and Finnishness, given the forum we are at here, is that some of these diversity things and so forth, how do you sort of see something Finnish in it, or something that comes from inside? Because on one hand, we know Finland is the least diverse like people on the planet. I mean, everybody looks the same and all of that, but still it's a very diverse society in a way, even if it has its clear blind spots. But how do you sort of see that in yourself? That is part of your diversity coming from that, or is it really what you have picked up through osmosis in your life since?
No, I think it's absolutely something that, at least to an extent, or to a part, like comes from our culture. Because like I think you're right. Like we don't have racial diversity, but what we have in our culture, like deep rooted, is that we kind of, it's solidarity. It's like we are seen as equals. Like even though the system or the society isn't perfect, but it's very much like built upon the foundation of like a tide lifts all boats, and like we need to take care of everyone in order for all of us to really like prosper. And so I think like that gives us a very strong or like foundational perspective into these things, thinking that okay, we should all inherently have the same rights.
Yeah.
So I think like in that sense, absolutely. And more specifically, when I think of like climate investing, for instance, there's big fundamental questions around like climate equity, justice. If we emit here, like it doesn't just affect us here; it affects everyone, and often actually the ones who are hit most are somewhere else.
Yeah. So climate tech and climate investing is, I mean, I guess everybody understands roughly what it is, but can you give a little bit more color on what is it that you or that segment in general is really looking for?
Yeah.
On one hand, we all know that investing is driven by making money.
Yes.
And most people sort of relate climate improvement or just caring for the climate as being something fairly distant from making money or business.
Yeah.
So how do these things come together in a way that actually can lead to some good results for both sides?
Yeah.
Or can they?
So climate tech is broad because like when we think about the world today, like we're still very much reliant on fossil fuels, for instance, and we are going through a major transition into a carbon-free economy. So we're decarbonizing our entire economy, and most of us are probably familiar with what has happened in transportation. So electric vehicles having really picked up, and now all the incumbents also making this like announcing their plans to move into this direction. But it also is, for instance, what we eat and what we consume. So it's food tech. It's not just plant-based alternatives to animal-based products, but it's also like fertilizers, like new types of fertilizers, and it's very broad. Then we think about industrial, that we have some really hard to abate sectors like steel and cement that are just absolutely massive at scale, and both the materials they use as well as the processes that they rely on are emitting a large chunk of the emissions today. And there's also like the built environment, like the way we live, what types of housing we build. So it's really broad, but it literally means that we need to decarbonize everything. And it sounds daunting because it is. It's very complicated. A lot of these things will also have to happen synchronously and in parallel. And there's all kinds of things that complicate this, especially because we don't have a lot of time. Yeah. So we also have to do this faster than we've ever done anything like this at this scale. But the way I see it is that it presents a huge opportunity. Yeah. It is both software, it's very much hardware as well. Both is absolutely needed. There are technologies that are very directly having an impact, as well as like enabling technologies, just like in tech in general. Yeah.
And it's of course something that you really have to chisel away at the issues in fairly small chunks, because you can't change the world, and specifically you can't change people's behaviors very fast. But just as you say, we don't have too much time to do it. So it's really a balance between when do you sort of take a leap versus not take a leap.
Yeah, and then there's the third pillar, which is like legislation. Like we are dealing with things like price on carbon. We've never had a price on carbon. Like what does a carbon market look like? Like how do we value something that's intangible and something that we're used to just like basically exploiting? So there's a lot of like fundamental sort of change that will have to happen, and it's tricky. But I'm actually pretty optimistic right now.
Good, good. So, have you looked at companies in sort of your interest sphere that would have come from Finland or Nordic countries, and how do you view them compared to some of the stuff that we see here in the States or globally?
So I would love to invest in companies in Finland and other Nordic countries, Europe in general. So far, the majority of our portfolio companies are based in the US, but I have invested in some in Germany and the UK. I have looked at some companies in Finland, and I do see that there's more happening in the space. I think it's a little bit behind in terms of what we see here, but it's also because like there's been just this massive boom of climate tech here in the valley, like, and you know, say there's like LA and a couple of other hubs, but here in particular, just like these past 2 years, I would say, like the landscape was very different, even back in like 2018, 2019. The biggest change has happened in the past 12 months, which is, a very short period of time.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do think that like here we're starting to see the sort of ambition level really rise, and we're also starting to see a couple of what I think are key changes that will help us succeed at this massive mission, you know. These are, for instance, different to the clean tech wave back in like 28, 29, 2010. For instance, like people, like more and more people from non-climate tech sectors are moving into this space, like wanting to make a difference, but they bring with them like their experience in like starting or growing or working at these like companies that have done very, very well in the past, and a lot of that knowledge and those skills are applicable in climate tech. Like we really need marketing people, we need HR people, we need engineers for sure, but we also need people in every manageable role.
Yeah. I guess also like everything in specifically in Finland, as that I know and we know is things have of course been behind. When I started in the business, it was like tens of years of difference in terms of how things were done in Finland, and it didn't really, venture capital hardly existed at that point in Finland. But it has caught up a lot. But I guess that this being really sort of a new field altogether, and as you say, it draws on people from other fields.
Yes.
And we don't have a very robust sort of second generation of entrepreneurs in Finland. Yes, there's still many of them. I mean, there are some, but most of them are still on their first sort of lap in it. So I guess it will come. But certainly when it comes to, in my experience, what I've seen, when it comes to sort of some of the technologies and of course the whole appreciation for the environment and climate and all of that, that's on a sufficient and good level there.
Yeah.
It's just finding those opportunities. And of course also Finland the culture is not known for taking big leaps. And this is more of a sort of, you have to really look far to see sort of the whole impact that you have to create.
Yes, you do have to get very creative here, and you have to be able to deal with a certain level of risk, especially, I mean, there are also like sectors like renewable energy, or, we talked about mobility already, that are like actually very mature. So that doesn't really require a lot of risk taking. Like you kind of know where it's headed, but there's definitely certain areas that are like very much in the sort of early stages of thinking about how to decarbonize, and those sectors like require a lot more risk. And I think one example would be I mentioned the industrial, like steel, cement. These are just like absolutely ginormous challenges. But say negative emissions, like we have Climeworks, which is a Swiss company that just recently opened their biggest facility to date in Iceland, called Orca, which is aiming at like the 4 tons a year level of direct air capture. And then we have like Charm Industrial, which is using basically this biomass to produce biofuels that they then pump underground to permanently sequester carbon. And they are now at like 5 tons. These are like tiny levels. Yeah. But when you think about like that's almost the entire industry, and you have Stripes and you have Microsofts and you have Shopify's like telling like we need more of these. Like we will pay a high premium. Like we're talking about $600, $700, $1,000 per ton of removed CO2, and there's just not a lot of supply. Like we are currently supply constrained, and it's a very interesting situation, but it's just so new. And also like negative emissions are barely baked into the net zero targets, and like especially like the sort of more like regulated, what do you call it? Like the basically they're not in the sort of plans in most cases. It is such a nascent industry that it's really, we have to figure all of that out.
So now you have a situation yourself where you haven't raised sort of external money into a fund for doing this, but there are people who do that. How do you cope with the fact that these types of projects do not really fit the model of venture capital, which usually works on a 10-year clock? You invest the first 5 years, you develop the next 5 years and exit, and basically have returned all of the money. Here we're talking, significantly longer times. How do investors view that? How do you view that yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think like we have briefly discussed like how broad climate tech is and how different verticals are at different stages of the sort of transition and the journey. So there are actually VC funds, like climate-focused VC funds that operate at the exact same sort of premises and like expectations than any other VC fund. And some of them like say like they only invest in software, and I haven't personally, for instance, invested in a single climate tech fund that only invests in software because I think that it's just not going to get us where we need to get to. But there's a few dozen unicorns already in the space, and there's the Teslas of the world, and you have Bill Gates saying that it won't be one, but it will be like 8 to 10 to however many like $1 trillion companies in this space. You have very like big names, like very well-known long-time VCs saying that there will be more money made in climate tech than in any other sector, like Chris Sacca, or he has raised a climate fund and very much believes that will return more than any of his previous investments. So I actually do think that this will return very well. When you look at like sort of more in more detail, like there are definitely areas that are just not there yet. They're like not necessarily ready to sort of fit the VC model, but there are certain areas like we've talked about the mobility sector and all that, where there's like it's literally like any other sector out there. So I think you can't say anymore like that it's one or the other, because climate tech is so broad, and we are seeing maturity, we are seeing returns, but we're also seeing things that are like very, very difficult and still very much like they're just the first movers, both on the founder side as well as the investor side.
Yeah.
And when I invest, I look for a significant climate impact, and the higher the climate, like potential climate impact, kind of like the more risk I'm willing to take. But there always has to be a path to, like a clear path to commercialization, and it still has to happen within a reasonable time frame.
Yeah.
We also do philanthropy, and that's a whole different story.
Yeah.
There's even a bucket in the middle, which is more for like concessionary type of capital, where your return expectations are lower. So I think all of that is needed, but what falls in the VC bucket, that has to fit the VC model.
Yeah, yeah. And the VC model is changing, and it has to change. And actually, big change just happened last week.
Yes,
with
Sequoia.
And but we won't get into that here. So if you could choose today to have a meeting with a sort of startup company that's already up and running tomorrow, that would be sort of the perfect fit for what you want and what you do, what fills your financial and your passion goals in this space. What could it be? What kind of a company could it be?
I think I'm an investor for the reason that I don't know if I'd be the best person to come up with like these ideas, but I can share some examples of like what I have already invested in and what clearly has kind of resonated with me. I do love it when a company solves for multiple issues, so like several problems at once. It's usually good in any type of investing. Like if they are really solving for real problems, like you just have a better chance at succeeding.
Yeah.
So a company called Droneseed is actually one of my kind of earlier investments, and what they do is that they do reforestation using these heavy lift drones. But what's sort of very unique about them and kind of why they are as important and impactful as they are is that they can go in like right after the wildfires happen. Because they're not dependent on manual labor, for instance, which is a huge bottleneck in the entire industry at the moment. So the rate at which afforestation happens is exceeding that of like reforestation, and we have this like growing void there. So they are solving for the bottleneck, which is the manual labor, and they can, for instance, go in right after the fire so that the initial like growth doesn't start to happen, so they don't need to like kind of go in and like clear out the space, So there's like process innovation in this. It's also when you think about the manual labor, like often like these forests are being planted like very difficult to access areas, like hills and like steep mountains and what have you. So unfortunately, it's very dangerous for these people as well, and many people don't last for very long because they basically get injured during the work that they're doing. So it's also kind of solving for this. One could also then say like, well, what happens to these jobs? It's true, they no longer have these jobs, but I very much believe that as we go through this transition, we will actually have like economic, financial prosperity, but we do have to be very, very thoughtful about how we do it, because it will have also negative implications on individual and sort of local levels. So therefore climate equity and justice are incredibly important topics to think about.
Yeah, it really sounds like 30 years ago, investing in tech was something that people, oh yeah, I understand. Yeah, you invest in technology. Yeah. Today we know what that is. Yeah. And what you're saying now is that investing in sort of climate tech or in climate really ends up being also a huge spread of almost anything that just sort of has enough of a sort of a climate improving angle to it.
Absolutely. And honestly, like if you are a founder today and you're thinking of founding a company that doesn't think about this and kind of incorporate these things into the business, I'm like not sure if that company should be founded. Like I do think that like the level of sophistication has gone up. You know, it's also a generational thing. Like you know, a lot of this change has been influenced by people who were born in the 90s or in the early 2000s, and even later than that. I don't fall into that category. I was born in the 80s. But I think it's like kind of probably starting around with that generation that was born in the 80s. There's just a lot more kind of expectations towards large corporations, politicians, like this sort of whole thinking has changed. And, you know, that's probably why we also see the world's largest corporations, like if you look at the Fortune 500, like I think it's like 40% of them have now made like net zero pledges. A lot of them still don't know how to get there, but at least, you know, they know that they have to think about these things.
Fantastic. Well, I certainly wish you, for your own sake, for my personal sake, and for everybody's sake, that you are successful in finding some of these, because it's if there is one thing that we can say for certain is that the opportunity and the need is there, and we need to do things about it, and there's lots of different things we can do about it, and so I thank you and I congratulate you on taking this very bold path of changing the world to in the way that you do.
Thank you.
So, with that, I want to, Kirsti, thank you very much for your time. Very interesting. We could go on for another hour or whatever in this discussion. It's very interesting. And but as I said, good luck and thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think I would just like to end by saying that, you know, we need everyone's contribution here. So really, if this is something that you have ever thought about or, you know, care about, there is room for every single one.
This is what you need to look into the camera. Yes.
Yes.
Please.
Like, we need everyone to help us get through this major transition into a decarbonized economy, which presents opportunities that we've never ever experienced before. Yeah. So if it's something you have thought about, I would say do something about it. We need you, we want you. And what I love about this industry is also that it's very, people are very willing to help. So a lot of us have come from different backgrounds, and we are all working towards a common goal. So let's just, we don't have a lot of time to waste, so let's get to action.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.